Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in sophomore English. We are coming now on page 1128, 1129 and following. As we've done in all of the other units of our textbook, we like to compare literary works. We're going to look at two titles from the mythic tradition, okay? And we're going to compare archetypal narrative patterns. I hope you're reading with me on 1128 really quickly. Archetypal narrative patterns are storytelling structures found in the literature of cultures around the world. These patterns often appear in stories from the oral tradition, such as folk tales, fairy tales, myths. Like familiar routines, patterns make the stories easier to remember and retell. Common archetypal narrative patterns include some of the following. I hope you'll have this in your notes at 2B. Series of tests a character must pass. I mean, we've seen this already, haven't we, in the Ramayana and other kinds of texts we've already read. A quest or a task a character must perform. We think, obviously, of Odysseus in the Odyssey. Secondary characters that guide and help the hero or heroine. Characters, events, objects that come in threes. That's important. Put that in your notes. Greedy, cruel, jealous relative who behaves unfairly. A hero who triumphs over stronger forces through cleverness or virtue, a just end that rewards good or punishes evil. These narrative patterns may seem very familiar to you, although they originate in folk literature. Archetypal structures continue to shape modern stories in all genres. Movies, television shows, video games are often built on such archetypes. You'll see this for the gamers in the house. You're going to see this right away. Some psychological theories hold that the existence of archetypal patterns in literature from every era and culture shows essential truths about how human beings understand and process information. This was certainly the argument of a great psychiatrist named Carl Jung, J-U-N-G, a student of Sigmund Freud, and as well the great anthropologist Joseph Campbell in his Power of Myth. You can study that more on your own at 3A. We're going to turn now to Cupid and Psyche, and that's where we're going to spend our time. Let's do a little bit of background work on 1129. You have dates there, Lucius Apuleus and Sally Benson. Although the tale of Cupid and Psyche goes back to Greek mythology, the best-known version is the Metamorphoses by the ancient Roman writer Apuleius. This work is often considered the world's first novel. A modern reteller, Sally Benson, won fame with her short stories, by the way, dates 1900 and 1972, fame with her short stories. Her collection, Meet Me in St. Louis, based on her own Missouri childhood, was adapted as a movie musical. Okay, let's turn now to this telling of Cupid and Psyche. Psyche is going to be a beautiful, mortal woman. Inadvertently, she's going to draw the attention and admiration away from Venus. We know about her, the goddess of love. Venus sends her son Cupid, the god of love, to exact revenge. As the story unfolds, Psyche learns about the value of trust and the power of true love to preserve through difficult circumstances. This myth contains archetypal patterns that you may quickly recognize. We just listed several. Let's now go to work with the text itself and do our best to follow along. Now, this is a fairly lengthy reading. So our goal here is, as we've said before, conquer monkey mind. See how well you do. We'll work at level 1, as we have done with prior readings, and then make sure that you've got it, and then we'll come to make our 2 at level 2 and free observations. Let's go to work now. Cupid and Psyche.
Cupid and Psyche, retold by Sally Benson. There once lived a king and queen who had 3 daughters. The 2 elder daughters were beautiful, but the youngest daughter, Psyche, was the loveliest maiden in the whole world. The fame of her beauty was so great that strangers from neighboring countries came in crowds to admire her, paying her the homage which is only due Venus herself. In fact, Venus found her altars deserted as men turned their devotion to the exquisite young girl. People sang her praises as she walked the streets and strewed chaplets and flowers before her. This adulation infuriated Venus. Shaking her silken locks in indignation, she exclaimed, "Am I then to be eclipsed by a mortal girl?" In vain did that royal shepherd, whose judgment was approved by Jupiter himself, give me the palm of beauty over my illustrious rivals Minerva and Juno. I will give this Psyche cause to repent of so unlawful a beauty. She complained to her son Cupid and led him to the land where Psyche lived, so that he could see for himself the insults the girl unconsciously heaped upon his mother. "My dear son," said Venus, "punish that beauty. Give thy mother a revenge as sweet as her injuries are great. Infuse into the bosom of that haughty girl a passion for some low, mean, unworthy being, so that she may reap a shame as great as her present joy and triumph."
Okay, let's pause for a second, put it at level 1. Two parts of this story. Now, from our study of the Odyssey, we spoke already, end of Edith Hamilton's mythology in our freshman year, you'll remember. We talked about the anthropomorphism of the gods. In other words, gods in the form of humans. Not just their physical form, but often their emotional, yes, way of acting as well. Here, notice we've got a very interesting story. Again, we begin with our threes. 3 daughters. Cupid, of course, or Psyche, of course, is the most beautiful of all of them. And notice Venus, the goddess of love, Aphrodite in the Greek tradition, of course, she is jealous by this. Ultimately, she wants to punish this girl for her beauty. Now, we, of course, know, because we are in high school as sophomores, that it has often been the case that sometimes if someone is considered beautiful, someone also is considered to be arrogant, conceited, mean, and all of those kinds of things, and therefore deserving of harsh treatment. We've got the same game being played here. Notice that Cupid is the son of Venus, and he's going to be brought into this whole project. Now, of course, we're going to have a dynamic at play here that's going to begin with an obvious question, so let's just write it down right now at 3B. Is it fair that someone who is considered beautiful has to often be treated differently? Is it true that beautiful people get treated differently from those who are perceived to not be beautiful? And is the concept of a beautiful person in and of itself kind of an insane notion? I'm with you now on 1131. Let's keep going, see what happens next in the story, all right?
Now there were 2 fountains in Venus's garden, one of sweet waters, the other of bitter. Cupid filled 2 amber vases, one from each fountain, and suspending them from the top of his quiver, hastened to Psyche's chamber, where she lay asleep. He shed a few drops from the bitter fountain over her lips, though she looked so beautiful in her sleep that he was filled with pity. Then he touched her side with the point of his arrow. At the touch, she awoke and opened her eyes on Cupid, who was so startled by their blue enchantment that he wounded himself with his own arrow. He hovered over her, invisible, and to repair the damage he had done, he poured the water from the sweet fountain over her silken ringlets. Psyche, thus frowned upon by Venus, derived no benefit from all her charms. All eyes were still cast eagerly upon her, and every mouth spoke her praise, but neither king, royal youth, or common man presented himself to demand her hand in marriage. Her 2 elder sisters were married to royal princes, but Psyche, in her lonely apartment, wept over her beauty, sick of the flattery it aroused, while love was denied her. Her parents, afraid that they had unwittingly incurred the anger of the gods, consulted the oracle of Apollo and received this answer: "The girl is destined for the bride of no mortal lover. Her future husband awaits her on the top of the mountain. He is a monster whom neither the gods nor men can resist." This dreadful decree of the oracle filled all the people with dismay, and her parents abandoned themselves to grief. But Psyche said, "Why, my dear parents, do you now lament me? You should rather have grieved when the people showered undeserved honors upon me, and with one voice called me Venus. I now perceive I am a victim to that name. I submit. Lead me to that rock to which my unhappy fate has destined me." She dressed herself in gorgeous robes, and her beauty was so dazzling that people turned away, as it was more than they could bear. Then, followed by wailing and lamenting crowds, she and her parents ascended the mountain. On the summit, her father and mother left her alone and returned home in tears.
All right, let's pause for a moment. Back to level 1. Again, let's just summarize. So we've got Cupid, who will be sent to Psyche in her sleep with two different kinds of drugs. You might call them drugs, this special kind of water. Notice that there's this question then, and because of her beauty, Cupid is going to be attracted to Psyche, okay? So again, we've got this story, it's a very old story of often it's almost always a male god being enchanted with a female mortal, and he's going to find some way to be able to have the girl, if you will. Notice in the meantime, the other two sisters end up getting married. Here again, archetypal patterns at play from stories, yes. And notice as well the distinction between beauty and love. While she's beautiful, Psyche can find no one who will in fact love her. She is, of course, treated almost like a goddess in terms of her beauty, but nobody actually wants to be with her and love her. Notice she says it. I am now a victim, she says. I perceive I'm a victim to that name of Venus. And because of this now, the oracle at Delphi, we've spoken about this before, a number of times in the Greek tradition. If you wanted to know something about the future, you went to Delphi, you spoke to the Apollo oracle, the oracle would tell you something. Here the message is, a monster must take Psyche. Notice in these kinds of stories, you never have the voice of reason that steps up and says, this is utter lunacy. Let's just go ahead and figure out another way to solve our problem of getting Psyche some kind of a husband. But notice now it's, yes, she's willing to be sacrificed. For those of you who are already smiling at 3a, yes, this is the sacrifice of Iphigenia all over again from our study in our freshman year of the Troy Tale. Same kind of gig, where a father is willing to sacrifice his daughter because the gods will it. And here we're going to have the same game being played all over. But notice, put it in your notes, Psyche is in fact willing to do this. She says, this is what I deserve, which is in and of itself interesting and disturbing. Okay, so here we go now. We're on 1132. Obviously, Psyche is about to meet Cupid.
While Psyche stood on the ridge of the mountain, panting with fear and sobbing aloud, the gentle Zephyrus raised her from the earth and bore her with an easy motion into a flowery dale. There she lay down on a grassy bank and fell asleep. She awoke refreshed and saw nearby a pleasant grove of tall and stately trees. She entered it and discovered a fountain sending forth clear and crystal waters, and near it stood a magnificent palace that was too stupendous to have been the work of mortal hands. Drawn by admiration and wonder, she walked through the huge doors. Inside, golden pillars supported the vaulted roof, and the walls were hung with delightful paintings. She wandered through the empty rooms, marveling at what she saw, when suddenly a voice addressed her. "Sovereign lady," it said, "all that you see is yours. We whose voices you hear are your servants, and shall obey all your commands with the utmost care and diligence. Retire, therefore, to your chamber, and repose on your bed of down, and when you see fit, repair to the bath. Supper awaits you in the adjoining alcove when it pleases you to take your seat there."
All right, let's pause for just a second. We'll play the same game again. So at 3A, some students quickly write down the story of Disney's Beauty and the Beast. No doubt, same gig going on here. Notice several interesting things. The girl is picked up. She's carried away to a Eden-like garden, this amazing place. She goes to sleep. She awakens. She finds a fountain. She finds a magnificent palace. She walks through the palace. She hears this voice tell her, "Welcome, you are here." In other words, let's put it in our notes. It's interesting in our story that what starts out looking kind of like a really horrific experience for Psyche is now all of a sudden going to end up being an adventure for her. So she, in very motific ways, she goes through her odyssey as well, an adventure of sorts, right? All right, here we go now. What's going to happen next?
Psyche listened with amazement, and going to her room, she lay down and rested. Then, after a refreshing bath, she went to the alcove where a table wheeled itself into the room without any visible aid. It was covered with the finest delicacies and the most wonderful wines. There even was music from invisible performers. She had not yet seen her destined husband. He came only in the hours of darkness and fled before dawn, but his accents were full of love and inspired a like passion in her. She often begged him to stay and let her behold him, but he would not consent. On the contrary, he charged her to make no attempt to see him, for it was his pleasure, for the best of reasons, to remain concealed. "Why should you wish to behold me?" he asked. "Have you any doubt of my love? If you saw me, perhaps you would fear me, perhaps adore me. But all I ask of you is to love me. I would rather have you love me as an equal than adore me as a god."
Now, this is a fascinating element to the story. Psyche, in all the way through the story, Psyche continues to just kind of accept, this is the way things are, all right? Dude, I'm at this amazing place where I hear voices talking. I got this amazing cuisine. The only deal is, notice, she's alone. Physically, she's not seen anybody. She has a relationship with Cupid, but that relationship cannot involve seeing him. She will fall in love with him, but she's not allowed to ever see him. Notice that the rules of the game, if we can say it this way, the rules of the contract, or the rules of the relationship are very simple. We are with each other at night, but I can never let you see me. Notice Cupid says to her, I would rather, look at it again on 11:32. Have you any doubt of my love? If you saw me, perhaps you would fear me, perhaps adore me, but all I ask of you is to love me. I would rather have you love me as an equal than adore me as a god. In other words, Cupid's suggestion here is that, well, because I'm a god, the only thing you could actually do is adore me if you could physically see me. Put this in your notes. This raises that interesting element of faith, as it sometimes is referred to, blind belief. The belief. In other words, Cupid is going to ask Psyche, you have to basically just trust me on this count. And then Psyche will have to make her decision. I wonder if she will be able to keep the rules of the game. Obviously, good stories lead to good predictions, yes?
This reasoning satisfied Psyche for a time, and she lived quite happily alone in the huge palace. But at length she thought of her parents who were in ignorance of her fate, and of her
11:33.
sisters with whom she wished to share the delights of her new home. These thoughts preyed on her mind, and made her think of her splendid mansion as a prison. When her husband came one night, she told him of her distress, and at last drew from him an unwilling consent that her sisters should be brought to see her. So, calling Zephyrus, she told him of her husband's command, and he soon brought them across the mountain down to their sister's valley. They embraced her, and Psyche's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Come," she said, "enter my house and refresh yourselves." Taking them by their hands, she led them into her golden palace and committed them to the care of her numerous train of attendant voices, to refresh themselves in her baths and at her table, and to show them all her treasures. The sight of all these splendid things filled her sisters with envy, and they resented the thought that she possessed such splendor which far exceeded anything they owned. They asked her numberless questions and begged her to tell them what sort of person her husband was. Psyche replied that he was a beautiful youth who generally spent the daytime in hunting upon the mountains. The sisters, not satisfied with this reply, soon made her confess that she had never seen him. They then proceeded to fill her bosom with dire suspicions. "Call to mind," they said, "the Pythian oracle that declared that you were destined to marry a direful and tremendous monster. The inhabitants of this valley say that your husband is a terrible and monstrous serpent, who nourishes you for a while with dainties that he may by and by devour you. Take our advice. Provide yourself with a lamp and a sharp knife. Put them in concealment so that your husband may not discover them, and when he is sound asleep, slip out of bed, bring forth your lamp, and see for yourself whether what they say is true or not. If it is, hesitate not to cut off the monster's head and thereby recover your liberty."
All right, let's pause for a second. So, the next element of the story. If part one of the story, it's a three-part story, easily divided. If part one of the story is Psyche ends up with Cupid and in this amazing mansion. Part two of the story is Psyche gets homesick and lonely. Duh, you think? She's all by herself. And so she convinces Cupid to allow her two sisters, who are of course archetypes. You can think about the number of stories that you could write down in 3A where two mean sisters show up. I mean, Cinderella immediately comes to mind, doesn't it? Sisters or stepsisters, here sisters. And immediately they're very envious of what it is that Psyche has in Cupid's mansion. So they're going to use that envy to instill that kind of seed of doubt. Who is this man that you are with? You don't even know who this guy is. Why don't you at least try and find out? Then, of course, the challenge to her. Go in with the lamp, see who your husband is, have the knife, because he's probably a disgusting sea monster and he's very dangerous, a nasty snake or something like this, you see. So anyway, notice, Psyche is going to fight against this, but ultimately, well, you can make your prediction. What do you imagine is going to happen next, right?
Psyche resisted these persuasions as well as she could, but they did not fail to have their effect on her mind, and when her sisters were gone, their words and her own curiosity were too strong for her to resist. She prepared her lamp and a sharp knife, and hid them out of sight of her husband. When he had fallen into his first sleep, she silently arose, and uncovering her lamp, beheld him. He lay there, the most beautiful and charming of the gods, with his golden ringlets wandering over his snowy neck and crimson cheek. On his shoulders were two dewy wings, whiter than snow with shining feathers.
11:34.
As she leaned over with the lamp to have a closer view of his face, a drop of burning oil fell on his shoulder and made him wince with pain. He opened his eyes and fixed them full upon her. Then, without saying a word, he spread his